Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by WealthManagement.com Senior Editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of WealthManagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement strategies, and much more, written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Now, our guest this week is Steve Lockshin. For anyone listening to this, he probably doesn't need an intro, but just in case, Steve is a principal of AdvicePeriod and a co-founder of Vanilla, the estate planning advisory platform. Prior to co-founding AdvicePeriod, Steve was chairman of Convergent Wealth Advisors, a company he founded in 1994. Steve helped pioneer the independent advisory industry, period, building one of the largest independent RIAs in the nation. Lenok Wealth Management was acquired by City National Bank in 2007. Steve is widely known for his contemporary approach to wealth advisory, as well as his estate planning knowledge, and is a frequent speaker on both topics. He's also advised numerous high-profile individuals, including Michael Jordan, the significance of which will become clear soon. And that's it. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Thanks for having me on board.
So the subject of today's episode is the sad story of Len Bias. Bias was a star basketball player at the University of Maryland. In his senior year, he was named ACC Player of the Year and was a consensus first-team All-American. He was picked second in the 1986 draft by the Boston Celtics and was, anticipated to act as a bridge from their current Larry Bird-led era dynasty into the future of, hopefully more championships. Tragically, 2 days after being selected, Bias died from cardiac arrhythmia induced by a cocaine overdose. Apocryphally, his first time ever trying the drug. That's not really up to this show to adjudicate. He had yet to sign an NBA contract and was in discussions with Reebok on signing a 5-year, $1.6 million endorsement deal at the time of his death. And again, that is $1.6 million in 1986 money. So although great riches were just around the corner for Bias, he and his family never actually got their hands on any of them because of the unfortunate timing of his death. Not that any death really is fortunately timed. College athletes back then were still not allowed to make money to preserve the air quotes ideals of amateurism. Even though these same ideals didn't prevent the universities they played for from monetizing those very same athletes. In fact, Bias, as was pretty common at the time for college athletes about to go pro and start earning big money, took out about $21,000 in loans in the lead up to the draft. So not only did Bias's family miss out on millions in his pro earnings, but they were actually left with debt. Bias's story, and the reason we're talking about it, is especially relevant today because of three little letters, NIL. The nation was just captivated by Caitlin Clark's legendary performances, leading Iowa to another women's final. And Clark really highlights the evolving landscape of college sports, with financial literacy now becoming almost as important as athletic skill. With her NIL value reaching $3.1 million, Clark exemplifies the opportunities and challenges faced by student athletes navigating significant earnings early in their career. Steve, do you mind explaining what NIL stands for in the first place and why it's such a sea change for student athletes?
Sure. NIL is simply name, image, and likeness. And so it's the value that one would attribute to their brand, if you will, their personal brand. So we think of people who endorse various clothes, cars, whatever it may be, and they're compensated for that, or they may sell items that relate to them. And those are all value related to their name, image, and likeness.
I believe that in social media nowadays, I think in the highest valued NIL athletes plays a humongous role as well.
Yeah.
So for advisors, I mean, what does this really mean? This is obviously a group that many advisors weren't targeting before because they flat out couldn't make money that they didn't have already going into college. So, I mean, do these sort of student athletes represent an opportunity for advisors?
I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, there's an opportunity to help folks that need help. I'd say the opportunity is pretty small
Mhm.
with respect to those that are going to realize significant dollars. I think the average NIL number is like $10,000 or something. It's not significant. You get to this small group of folks that have real significant money. And I think between either receiving the money or depending on what their NIL money is for, the transferability of that, there may be some planning to do. But I would say for every person, if you've got money or a family, having some basic estate planning in place
Mhm.
is important.
So, you just mentioned the word transferability, and that's sort of what we're all about on this podcast, because that's really sort of what estate planning is.
Yep.
So what are some of the unique challenges in terms of transferability, both for NIL specifically and just for young people in general?
Let's just assume we're just talking about your actual name and likeness, so that somebody giving somebody the ability to use your name and likeness. And there are actually companies out there that trade in that business and take over your name and likeness, and they'll market it and they'll rev share with you, things of that nature. But when you die, the transferability of your name and likeness becomes an issue, because depending on the state and the laws of that state, there's a certain period in which that statute ends and these things become public domain. And you'll even see things like Robin Williams in his will said, you can't use my name and likeness for 20 years. So he effectively nullified the value of it. So if you think about the inverse of that, there are ways to monetize a name and likeness. And if it's well thought out, then you can transfer those and effectively plan with those.
Mhm. Yeah, it's I think the most egregious example of this was there was a spat of holograms a few years back,
Yeah.
where you would have sort of Tupac Shakur showing up at stuff from beyond the grave as a hologram.
Wait, that
Because
wasn't him?
I know, I can't believe, sorry, it's a spoiler alert, folks. Yeah,
Jeez.
to any of our listeners, that wasn't really Tupac. But yeah, that's always, I think, the example that comes up as sort of the ridiculous end game of these name, image, and likeness conflicts, where, like, the idea of the sort of puppet of this dead, celebrity being trotted out.
Yeah, but I mean, there's real value in these. I mean, I first started learning about this from the person who runs the estate of a very well-known deceased singer. And they've managed to optimize how they could turn his name and likeness into significant wealth for the family and for as long as possible. So I think Tennessee is the state that it's 50 years, I believe, that you can control it after the death. So knowing what you're doing really matters in this case, and setting things up so there is transferability. And if we're talking about these athletes, I think Shaq's son is an example, or sorry, LeBron's son is an example where he's got a pretty hefty NIL value. If they can figure out how to transfer that, then all the growth on that is outside their state, and you can do some real good planning with it.
I think actually LeBron's son is an awesome example too of this idea of sort of that the NIL value can be sort of divorced from necessarily how good, and quote unquote, the athlete is.
Mhm.
LeBron's son obviously is an amazing athlete. Anyone who's a Division I athlete is, like a different species than your average person. But they, he in terms of that ecosystem is sort of towards the bottom. He's a young guy, he's still trying to find his way, and yet he's perhaps the most valuable NIL athlete going. And it's based, obviously, he's LeBron's son, so his father has a lot to do with it, but it's sort of divorced necessarily. This sort of unhealthy following maybe that Bronny has is pretty divorced from whether or not he's actually playing basketball well. And is more sort of a personality thing, which is why we talk about name, image, and likeness. This is why it's so valuable, right? Even if he's not playing well, that just him, the idea of him, is still has great value.
Without a doubt. And there's some amazing players that have no personality and have limited NIL value, or let's call it, professional value. So I think it's the whole package, not to depart from sports, but just look at what the Kardashians have done with
Mhm.
effectively nothing.
Yeah, the
Created
famous for being famous idea.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about transferability, and setting it up correctly. So, I mean, again, but we're talking about estate planning for very young people. So, I mean, what does that look like in action? If we're trying to set up, an NIL athlete, well, someone who has some personality, maybe isn't a Ronnie James, but is, has monies that they need to worry about and an attractive image. What does it look like to set this up in a way that, transferability is possible and smooth?
Well, I mean, let's just hit the foundational stuff first. So, in most states, if you die intestate and you're single, it's going to move to parents or siblings or some combination of that. And so dying without a will just means you're going to have some probate in that regard. But if you have significant wealth, then being able to, and I'm sorry, I should go back and add, I do think having some core or essential documents that allow somebody you trust, probably, parents of an athlete, to take over if you're incapacitated. Just having, your core powers for healthcare and financial are essential. But let's now move on to somebody that's actually built up some wealth and wealth that is expected to expand. Understanding whether or not you can transfer that, if it could be ultimately incorporated, create an entity that it pays through and transfer that entity. Those are the kinds of things that create transferability so that the appreciation can end up outside of your state. And we've done this effectively for a number of our clients. And it's amazing what you can do. If there's significant dollars running through these things and you start early, you can basically neutralize the estate tax impact of someone's estate by moving things out early and keeping them as a grantor trust.
So, you mentioned some key documents earlier. Do you mind sort of expanding on that idea? Because I think, a lot of listeners hear estate planning and they think will, and then that's it. But I think for a lot of people who know estate planning, it's those other documents that are potentially more important than the will. So, do you mind laying out sort of what you're talking about there?
No, I agree, and I'll take the words you said earlier. I was smiling when you said them, when you said any D1 athlete you gave them some high compliment. My son is a senior and captain on the Princeton lacrosse team, and so when we were
serious business,
so and they're a decent team. I never thought about until we got probably in first year into vanilla was having healthcare and HIPAA releases and healthcare powers in case something happened to him at school. And we went to the hospital and they're like, he's an adult. We don't have to tell you anything. Mm-hmm. And so I think having durable powers and having a HIPAA release are essential in that regard. And to the extent he had any money, which he's got some money saved up, having financial powers, so a power of attorney so that we can take care of his affairs if he was unable to pay his bills, et cetera, are all important things. So I think what we're calling essentials at Vanilla is a package that's just those things. So if you have an adult child that's not married, kind of you're the person who's in charge, those are, I think, essential documents. Then once they are either married or they start building up some real assets or they've got a family, I think moving on to, at the very least, a will and revocable documents are important so that administration is minimized in the event something were to happen to them prematurely.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up this idea of the HIPAA documents, and because student athletes and college students in general, sort of, it's just a good thing for all college students to have. They sort of exist in that awkward position that you mentioned of like legally an adult, but not even remotely close to being actually an adult. And so many of them, I mean, obviously people, grew up differently, but I don't think many people trust that their 19-year-old is going to make the best healthcare decisions for themselves. Plus, parents have been used to making that child's healthcare decisions for them for his entire life or her entire life.
Yeah.
So that's, these student athletes are in this awkward period where, they're legally an adult, but they have young-ish and generally involved parents still. And they may even have very young children, depending on sort of where along their life they are. So it creates this sort of a unique sort of estate planning situation. Normally, we think of estate planning, you think of an older person, likely doesn't have living parents, maybe has even adult children. So, estate planning for someone who has, young living parents, very young children, is likely unmarried. That's a whole different ballgame, separate from, what you would traditionally think.
100%. And by the way, obviously we're focused on athletes today, but you don't have to be an athlete to get in a car accident or get hurt playing intramural sports or whatever it is. So I'd say, again, any adult that is, still under the care of their parents or just doesn't have a spouse or significant other, these are important documents.
Beyond the transferability, what is, as if I'm an advisor looking to, either help, or an estate planner looking to help these young people, what about just the psychological impact of having any amount of money? I mean, you were talking about, people who have, oh, he only has $10,000. But I mean, if you handed me $10,000 in cash when I was 19 years old, that's plenty of money to get in trouble with. And certainly enough to mess you up even a little bit if you all of a sudden get it. So, I mean,
Yep.
how much of a role do advisors and estate planners play in sort of guidance and, helping, these young athletes who now have these opportunities that they never have had before?
I mean, I'll give you the good news, bad news. I think because, for years we handle a lot of athletes, and now that we've whittled that down to a very, very small number, and they're all retired and they're all very, very well off financially. And the reason is that while someone's on the rise or they become wealthy, there is a line around the block of people who want that business. In fact, I remember the first time I landed an NFL quarterback, and that was my first athlete client. And I'm like, we're set. We're going to get every football player in the NFL. And then we'll, I mean, and it isn't like that, because every advisor out there wants that business because they think the same things I thought at the time, and they're willing to do it for free or do whatever. And the real problem that comes out of that is there's a bunch of yes men and women that become their advisors and their posse, I think, help facilitate bad decisions. And so what we ended up seeing was a lot of money out the door, not a lot of long-term planning, very short-term planning, which is what can I have today? They weren't thinking about the impact of pay now or pay later. And so I think from an estate planning perspective, it's the stuff we talked about. If they're going to have a large estate, then maybe it's time to start planning early. Although I think it'd be tough to talk a 20-year-old into giving assets away irrevocably. I do think getting the core stuff done would be an easy conversation. But at that point, I think the estate planner probably leaves the discussion unless there's ongoing growth of the wealth and they're doing more planning. But the financial advisor has a ton of opportunity to help teach them how to budget and be smart. And I look at, I just did a podcast the other day with Shane Battier, who played for Duke and then went on to play in the NBA.
Shane Battier is one of the most astonishingly eloquent humans I've ever heard speak, period. I've heard him say quotes that you would think were a philosopher, but it was something he tore off just off the top of his head in a locker room while wearing a towel. So
Yeah,
he's a very smart guy.
He's smart, as you said, he's beyond articulate, and he's extremely thoughtful. And as we were talking about this, Shane made the comment that, I grew up with nothing. We literally lived paycheck to paycheck. And the sense of fiscal responsibility that I had early helped guide my decisions long term. And Shane can now do whatever he wants because he's been very thoughtful about his savings over his career. And so I really think that's the opportunity that an advisor has, is to help teach these young folks about budgeting and the impact of compound wealth and being smart tax-wise and planning in that regard.
Yeah, and I have to imagine, I guess, that even if you're even getting a chance to sit in front of one of these kids, then they're already somewhat responsible in that they've at least recognized the need to have an advisor, at least to think about it. So there's at least something there.
Yeah, although I think we could probably break them into two categories, and these numbers are purely made up, but I'd say it's probably 90-10. 90% get chased by somebody that sees an opportunity, and 10 have the foresight to say, I really ought to focus on this and be smart about it. And that was the problem. I mean, if you think about the folks that I worked with way back when, I mean, they all had top agents. They were serious earners. They had access to everything, and yet they were making horrible decisions despite telling them to do something different, because they felt they were invincible. I mean, I think the average NFL career is 2.5 years or something. And these people were spending everything and then some, taking on debt because they thought they were going to play in the NFL till they were 85. And just a dose of reality, I think, is essential for these folks.
Yeah. And I mean, that the earning window is vanishingly small. Even, first of all, for people who go pro, obviously pro careers for the average athlete are super short. But also, I think now with NIL, a lot of these athletes who are having NIL deals are in sports where there isn't really a future to go pro in. So the NIL is the money they're going to make. I know, like, my wife is way into competitive cheerleading, and there are a number of influencer quote cheerleaders who in college they have huge reach and they make a ton of money and their NIL deals are huge, but it's like, where do you go? There's not like there's a pro cheerleading league that they can go into that's going to, match any sort of that earning. So like, that's only going to decrease over time. So
I'm glad that's how you finished that paragraph, because I was worried you're going to say my wife is an NIL athlete.
Oh no, I mean, no, we're both far from that. Those days are long past. But it's just that idea of that very tiny earnings window, even where maybe they won't even be going pro. Maybe the NIL that's just it.
Yeah, I mean, it almost would have been better if NIL forced them to put it into a retirement plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there was a penalty to take it out. I mean, there needs to be some kind of guidance. I often use the term loaded gun when I talk about estate planning and parents passing their estate planning problem to their kids versus doing thoughtful planning that lasts for generations. And I think the same is true here. Do we hand these kids a loaded gun to start making bad decisions early, and then they get in a hole they can't dig out of, versus help them to make smart decisions out of the gate so they can extrapolate that into a more thoughtful route with respect to their wealth.
Mm-hmm. So, earlier on in the conversation, you mentioned trusts as sort of a prime mover, and you mentioned Grat specifically, but there are many other types. Do you mind just talking a bit about sort of the use of that particular tool, both, just specifically in this situation and just in general?
You mean just using what a trust is?
The value, what a trust offers and sort of, what it can do, why a young person might want to start putting money in trust, that they necessarily can't reach anymore, or for the most part.
There's we'll put revocable trust over to the side for the minute, and that's just a basic estate planning solution to say, who gets what when if you were to pass. But for irrevocable planning, I actually would kind of split that into two categories. One, putting an adult in charge, and I don't literally mean an adult, although there probably be somebody who would help be responsible, putting a fiduciary in charge. So if I were an athlete, or I were talking to a young athlete, I would say, find somebody who's really smart that you trust, who's a fiduciary, and make them the trustee of your trust, and put your money in there so that you can't make a dumb decision or an impetuous decision. And that's could be, any form of irrevocable trust with whatever bells and whistles you want in terms of flexibility. The other side of that is for a purely estate planning reason, and it can be the same trust. An irrevocable trust is an irrevocable trust. It's just the feature set that you employ with it. But anything you put in that irrevocable trust will grow outside of your estate. And so if we pick one of these athletes that does somehow make it and creates a very successful career, now they've got tens of millions of dollars in this trust, the estate tax is 40% at its highest level. So they can avoid that tax on the transfer of that wealth to their children and future heirs by planning appropriately. So I think it serves a double prong purpose of protecting them and reducing their estate liability later. And there are mechanisms where they can still benefit in certain ways from the trust. So it's not like they didn't get any enjoyment from their earnings over their lifetime.
Yeah, I imagine that would be a tough sell to a 19-year-old who's finally making money. Like, okay, now take it all away and put it in this box you can't touch.
It would, but I'll tell you, and maybe I'm just a decent salesman. Both of my boys, I talked to funding their Roths as early as they could and explained they couldn't touch the money until they were 59 and a half without penalty. And they have done it. And I think we should encourage all of the kids to optimize everything they can. I assume the NIL money, if this is all they're earning, would allow them to set up Roths if the numbers are low enough. So they could contribute to a Roth as an example. And that's right there a great education, because that money can grow for a very long time and come out tax-free, and maybe even be that the rescue for their retirement that they never thought they'd need.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's not even an irrevocable trust. That's just a retirement vehicle.
These very basic planning vehicles, the earlier you get them in place, the value compounds, almost as if compounding interest is a powerful tool.
It's insane. It's just showing people what the difference between starting at 20 versus 30 versus 40 is amazing.
So that's about all the time that we have for today's show. I'd love to thank Steve Lockshin for taking the time to come on and talk about sort of this interesting sea change for young athletes and sort of how advisors can help them and how young athletes can help themselves in terms of setting themselves up for future success and not letting that loaded gun go off in their face, I think, as Steve put it there, that don't turn that boon that they've received, that they've worked for it, into something that will ruin the rest of their lives. So thanks so much for coming on, Steve.
Thanks for having me on the show.
And for all the listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Informa WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.